Well, tonight we're going to look at a little more from Deuteronomy. So the text that we started looking at, and we'll look at a little more, is found on chapter 4, verse 24. Deuteronomy 4, verse 24. This text has several reasons why it's an important verse. It says, "For the Lord thy God is a consuming fire, even a jealous God." The word jealous has to do with marriage. And so it's telling us that if we wander away from God, if we get wrapped up in things that He told us not to get wrapped up in, then He gets jealous because we promised at our baptism to belong to Him. Just like when we take our marriage vows, we promise to stick together as long as life lasts. And so that's very helpful to see the love of God. You know, some people see only the justice of God in the Old Testament, but there's a lot of the love of God in the Old Testament if you pay attention to what it's saying in different places. But the one that we're going to look at is this idea that God is a consuming fire. Now, maybe you've been exposed to the idea that God doesn't kill. It may not be as big of a false teaching today as it was for a while, but I have a book or two in my library in which somebody tried to prove that God doesn't kill anybody. Oh, you have that book?
I don't think so. We heard a lot about him 20 years ago.
Okay, yeah. And then one of the Maxwells got involved in that idea, and some of my close friends kind of got swayed by what Maxwell said to start thinking that way. And I'm sure it's not dead. You know, once an error comes up, it keeps going. And so what we're going to share tonight will, I think, make it crystal clear. Yes?
God only supplies the fire and the fire kills.
Yeah. Well, all right. Now, we looked at a couple of thoughts already, but most of it is still ahead. So we'll start, if you have your book, it's on page 24 and the second column where it says Desire of Ages 591. I'm going to give several examples of different situations and so on. It says, His voice, meaning Jesus, sounded like a trumpet through the temple. The displeasure of His countenance seemed like consuming fire. So He wasn't burning them, but just the godliness that was shining out through Jesus felt to them like a consuming fire. With authority, He commanded, "Take these things hence." Now, of course, they were not in harmony with God, and that's the reason that it reacted that way upon them. But He says to the wicked, "I am a consuming fire." Now, they claimed to be righteous, but really, they were hypocrites. They were not doing what is right. In the open, they tried, to make everything look good, but behind the scenes, they weren't living a godly life. One example of that is Simon. I believe Simon is the one that had an affair with Mary, and they're the ones that somebody arranged to walk in on and catch them in the act. And then she was dragged before Jesus and, told that, she was caught in the act. But Simon wasn't brought, only her. And the Old Testament taught that it was supposed to be both, not just the one. Anyway, that's the kind of lives that a lot of them lived. And so to them, Jesus was a consuming fire. Here's one from the flood. Probably the flood is the greatest example of destruction. Sodom is also an example, but the flood is a unique one because of this reference. Third spiritual guest, page 70. Trees, buildings, rocks, and earth were hurled in every direction. The terror of man and beast was beyond description. Now, the question is, who was doing all this destruction? And even Satan himself, who was compelled to be amid the warring elements, feared for his own existence. Well, then it couldn't have been Satan, right? That rules him out. Satan's not the one destroying the people that were destroyed by the flood. It wasn't Satan. So, and they weren't destroying themselves. There's only three possibilities: God, Satan, or self-destruct. And so they're not destroying themselves. They wanted to stay alive. They tried their best to stay alive. We're told they got on some of the strong animals, and they knew the animal would fight for life, and they were hoping that way they could stay alive. Some went up on the highest places and even climbed trees to try to stay out of the, destruction, but it didn't work. They all got destroyed. So there's only one left, and that's God, that sent that destruction and let Satan have a little taste of his kingdom by making him stay in the midst of that terrible storm. Then great controversy, page 35 and 6. The Jews had forged their own fetters. They had filled for themselves the cup of vengeance. In the utter destruction that befell them as a nation, and in all the woes that followed them in their dispersion, they were but reaping the harvest which their own hands had sown. Now that's the kind of reference that leads people off into a ditch, I believe. However, when we understand both the Bible and the writings of Ellen White, we have to find all the references that deal with that, and then we have to find an interpretation that fits all of them. If we don't find one that fits all of them, we haven't gotten the right answer. Yes?
But I think that God did do that, but he gave them 100 years to do right.
Right.
To choose right.
Right.
It wasn't God who made them that way.
No. And that's what this reference is talking about. They ruined themselves.
Yes.
Yes. And the same, as we're reading about the Jews, they ruined themselves. Now God does the destroying, but people ruin themselves. Says the prophet, O Israel, thou hast destroyed thyself. But actually, in this case, God used the Roman army to destroy them. But they are responsible. They destroyed themselves. Then it says, for thou hast fallen by thine iniquity. Their sufferings are often represented as a punishment visited upon them by the direct decree of God. It is thus that the great deceiver seeks to conceal his own work. So Satan works to tempt them. They listen. God works mightily to save them, but they don't listen. And so they destroy themselves. And Satan wants the blame to go on God and say, you have no right to destroy them. By stubborn rejection of divine love and mercy, the Jews had caused the protection of God to be withdrawn from them. And Satan was permitted to rule them according to his will. So in this case, and there are different ways that it happens. The flood was one way, this is another way. God steps back and he says, you love sin, so I'm turning you over to Satan. And as a result of being turned over to Satan, their nation got destroyed, and they had a lot of horrible things that took place. But you can't say that was the way the flood took place, because there was nobody else to destroy them other than God. The horrible cruelties enacted in the destruction of Jerusalem are a demonstration of Satan's vindictive power over those who yield to his control. So yes, some areas of destruction God is not responsible for, only in the sense that he withdraws from them. Now some people would say, he has no right to withdraw, he should stay there. No. When he has exhausted all the tools that he has to save somebody, they're doomed. They've ruined themselves. And so sometimes God steps back, and I believe that's what he's doing right now. God is stepping back. The Spirit is being withdrawn from the earth. Nothing is normal anymore. Right now we're in an abnormal dry spell. I don't believe it's ever been like this in my lifetime anyway, here in this part of the country. But nothing is usual. Yes.
Pastor, you're really awakening when you read these two verses of Psalm 19. Verse 8 says, the statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. So if we accept God's commandments, our eyes will see truth. We'll know what's truth. And we'll love God. That's what we, for those people who fail to do. And in verse 9 it says, the fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. But, here it is, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So these judgments are falling on souls that just refuse to love God and to love his law, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. And then, of course, the righteous suffer with it in the case of, many of these things. But in Jerusalem, fortunately, we're told, not one Christian perished. They all listened to what Jesus said, and they all got out of the city. So they didn't suffer those terrible things where Satan was allowed to have full control of that city. And then, of course, we know in the time of trouble, it will be the same, that God will protect his children, but the rest of the world will be turned over to Satan, and he will have the full control. Actually, both things are happening, as I understand it. The world is turned over to Satan's control, but on top of that, God is sending the plagues. Satan is not sending them, but God is sending the plagues. So they're getting the judgments of God and the control of Satan at the same time. It's going to be the worst possible time for people to be alive. Okay, great controversy, page 37. Like Israel of old, the wicked destroy themselves. Now the Mike Klutz, they read that, they say, aha, he's so loving. He doesn't destroy anybody. Like Israel of old, the wicked destroy themselves. They fall by their iniquity. By a life of sin, they have placed themselves so out of harmony with God. Their natures have become so debased with evil that the manifestation of His glory is to them a consuming fire. So, I suppose we could say God doesn't have to come close to them and He wouldn't consume them. But it's very clear here that the responsibility, that's the best description I can come up with. The responsibility for the lost does not rest on God in any sense, because He has exhausted every avenue to save them. And so He is not responsible in that sense for the destruction of the wicked. And yet, He is the one that destroys them. And, He comes close, and as a result, they're being so out of harmony with Him, it causes a fire and they are consumed by the fire. A third Bible commentary, 1166. There are limits even to the forbearance of God. The boundary of His long suffering may be reached, and then He will surely punish. See, we have to reconcile those two ideas. God does punish, but He doesn't punish until His long suffering has been exercised. And I like one statement, I'm not sure I put that one in here, but His mercy can be exhausted. When His mercy is exhausted, then He punishes. And when He does take up the case of the presumptuous sinner, now it's not the one that's trying to do right and they fall, it's the presumptuous sinner that says, I don't care what God thinks, I want to do this. And when He does take up the case of the presumptuous sinner, He will not cease till He has made a full end. You know what one of the problems is? I believe that today there's so much talk about the love of God, which I believe we do need to talk about, but there's so much talk of that God's justice is not really understood. Now, His justice is loving, and His love is just. But today we're not used to justice. We hope the policeman will not give us a ticket. We're always hoping that what we did bad, we won't get punished for, or that we'll get by with it, and nothing will happen. But God is perfectly just, and He does not let that happen. He can forgive when people become sorry, but if they don't become sorry and they don't receive forgiveness, they have to receive justice. That's also part of God's character just as much as love is a part of His character. So here, what we're reading about is justice. When God takes up their case, He will make a full end. And it will not be pretty. It will not be enjoyable. Very few realize the sinfulness of sin. They flatter themselves that God is too good to punish the offender. But the cases of Miriam, Aaron, David, and many others show that it is not a safe thing to sin against God in deed, in word, or even in thought. This is talking about on purpose, doing it on purpose. And when we don't do it on purpose, we see it and we say, Lord, please forgive me. I really don't want to be doing that type of thing. Please help me next time. But this is when people do things, on purpose. And we know what happened to Miriam. She caught leprosy. And if it hadn't been for the prayers of Moses, she probably would have died of leprosy. But she became sorry and God delivered her from it. God is a being of infinite love and compassion, but he also declares himself to be a consuming fire, even a jealous God. Now, there is another aspect of jealousy that we ought to talk about for a minute. God he's not pleased when people mistreat his children, the ones that belong to him. Just like a good husband, if someone is mistreating his wife, he's not going to stand by and let that happen. He's going to do something about that. And so God is the same. He's jealous for our safety, for our happiness. And so the wicked are always making trouble for the righteous. They always do, in one way or another. Even inadvertently, by spreading sin everywhere, it makes us exposed sometimes to seeing things that are sinful. And so God says, I will work with them, but ultimately, if they don't turn around, I'm going to stop them from harming my children. I'm going to deal with them. This he has to do in justice. He cannot ignore that. And so that reference kind of brings that point out. Fourth, spiritual gifts, section A, page 52. Some can see only the destruction of God's enemies, which looks to them unmerciful and severe. They do not look upon the other side. But let everlasting thanks be given that impulsive, changeable man, with all his boasted benevolence, is not the disposer and controller of events. And then it quotes a verse from the Bible, the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. Let me just give you one example in this country. We have all but eliminated the death penalty. And so people do horrible things, maybe they kill several people and they get put in prison and they end up, living the rest of their life, even though it's in prison. Some even get out. It's not that way. When God was ruling Israel, it was not that way. And when we treat sin lightly, we may feel we're being very kind, we're being very, merciful to people. But if we could look at the other side, is it merciful for people to find that they can get away with those kind of things and never have to pay the price? It ends up causing a lot of people to suffer because we don't deal with sin like we should. God's way is the most merciful way. He says, you kill somebody, you get killed. And this causes people to stop killing one another because they know what the result is going to be. And the result is serious. And this is merciful, but our society is not really geared this way. And so when we read these things, we try to take our culture right now and weave it into the Bible and try to make the Bible come out in harmony with our culture. But the Lord has tried to help us with all these references. In the end, when everything is explained, everybody will say, God has been merciful, and every time he exhibited justice, it was the right thing to do. We'll be able to see that. I like this reference because it really helps put us as human beings in our place. You know, it says, thanks be given that impulsive, changeable man, with all his boasted benevolence, is not the disposer and controller of events. Desire of Ages 764. By a life of rebellion, Satan and all who unite with him place themselves so out of harmony with God that his very presence is to them a consuming fire. The glory of him who is love will destroy them. Yes.
But how wonderful it is that the redeemed will be living in this fire, and it won't burn them.
Well, apparently it reacts different on them. Like, if we had out here in the sun, we had a stick of margarine or a bowl of margarine, and we had a lump of clay. The sun, it's the same sun, but it does two different things because of the material. And that's kind of the idea I get here, that the righteous don't get burned. They don't feel like they're in a fire. But the wicked, they feel, well, they really are in a fire, to be around him. And he's not changing. He's not doing anything different than what he is as by very nature. He's not doing anything different. But that is the result of them putting themselves out of harmony with God. In the 1888 materials, 485, it says, I have been shown that the hand of the Lord is stretched out already to punish those who will become monuments of divine displeasure and holy vengeance. For the day of recompense has come when men who exalted the man of sin in the place of Jehovah, in worshiping an idol Sabbath, in the place of the Sabbath of the Lord Jehovah, will find it a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, for he is a consuming fire. Yes.
David knew that and understood that, and that's why he said, let me fall in, I'm paraphrasing, God's hands.
Right.
And not man's hands. I think that's what in 2 Samuel.
Yes. That's right. Now, right now, these people get bold and they promote and they ridicule Sabbath keepers, but the day is coming when God will deal with them. And when he starts dealing with them, they're not going to be very happy about what's going on. And then, of course, in the end, will be destroyed in hellfire. Now, this last one, it's a little bit long, but to me, it's really the kind of reference that you can't twist. Some references, you can twist it. But there's always at least one or two that's so clear, you can't twist it. This comes from the 12th Manuscript Releases, page 207 and 8. The wrath of God is soon to fall on all the sinful and disobedient. God's love is represented in our day as being of such a character as would forbid his destroying the sinner. See, that's what Mike Clute and others like him, Maxwell, were saying. Men reason from their own low standard of right and justice. Then it quotes a Bible verse from Psalm 50:21. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such an one as thyself. You know, we're so inferior. How could we think we can tell God how to do it better? I mean, that's the epitome of pride, really, isn't it? How can we tell God how to do it better? We can't. They reason as to how they would act under the circumstances and decide God would do as they imagine they would do. So, for instance, if somebody killed our partner even, somebody really dear to us, and we took it upon ourselves to kill them, we might not really be aware of all the circumstances and situations. You see, we're too finite. But we think that it would be wrong sometimes for us to do things like that. God's goodness and long forbearance, his patience and mercy exercised to his subjects, will not hinder him from punishing the sinner who refused to be obedient to his requirements. So again, we see the mercy of God is exhausted, and he comes to the point where justice must be given. The plea may be made that a loving father would not see his children suffering the punishment of God by fire while he had the power to relieve them. But God would, for the good of his subjects and for their safety, punish the transgressor. So there's, I believe, a very key point. The wicked will trouble the righteous for eternity if they are allowed to live. And God says, I'm not going to let my children suffer, because these people have had every opportunity to turn to God, and they have rejected every opportunity I gave them. They're set. They cannot change. No matter how long I give them, they cannot improve. They cannot change. They've ruined themselves. And so to destroy is not bad in that setting. It is merciful. God does not work on the plan of man. He can do infinite justice that man has no right to do before his fellow man. And then he gives a wonderful example. I really liked this one when I found it. Noah would have displeased God to have drowned one of the scoffers and mockers that harassed him. See, Noah would have been wrong to destroy one of those people. But God drowned the vast world. Who did? God did. He drowned the whole world. And he's not guilty of any misdeed in doing it. Lot would have had no right to inflict punishment on his sons-in-law, but God would do it in strict justice. So based on what I found, I believe it's a strange act, like the Bible says. It's not something God enjoys doing. It's not something he looks forward to. He's not laughing at the destruction of the wicked. He's, none of that. But He will do it when he doesn't use some other method like backing off and letting Satan have control. And there are times like the flood, destruction of Sodom, hellfire, 7 last plagues, when God is the one dispensing the justice, but never is he responsible for failing to do something to save them, and they have rejected it until they are ruined, and so God is not to blame for having to destroy them. Well, there's probably more, but I tried to keep these things as brief as I could. Verse 25, going back to your Bible now. Let's see how much time we have. Well, we can go a little bit more. Verse 25, when thou shalt beget children and children's children, and ye shall have remained long in the land, and shall corrupt yourselves, and make a graven image, or the likeness of anything, and shall do evil in the sight of the Lord thy God, to provoke him to anger. And we'll go on in a minute, but God reads the future. And he warned them against idolatry, but he turns around and speaks to them through Moses. And he says, I know you're going to do it, but I'm going to give you a warning to try to help you not to do it. And it's in the next verse. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that ye shall soon utterly perish from off the land whereunto ye go over Jordan to possess it. Ye shall not prolong your days upon it, but shall utterly be destroyed. Now God made some wonderful promises to the Israelites, but it was based upon obedience. He also makes it very plain. I have other promises. If you disobey, that's the promise you get. He always did his best to try to stop them, from disobedience. But one of his ways of stopping them from disobedience was to warn them what would happen. And he said, you won't be able to keep that land. If you disobey, other nations will capture you. They will carry you away. You will end up being destroyed just like the Canaanites were if you don't obey. But in spite of that, they failed. Now, the question is, what about Adventists? Have we obeyed? Are we obeying? Can we expect to reap the promises if we don't obey? I don't believe we can. We have to be interested in learning God's ways and obeying God's ways. Otherwise, we will reap trouble. And trouble even is part of his way of trying to turn us around. I think we have some significant trouble ahead of us right now. I don't know whether you heard the result of the autumn council, but it was being discussed what to do with some of these entities of the church that choose to ignore the policies of the church and to do their own thing, like what's happened in California with setting up a woman to be the president of the conference. And what they ended up deciding to do was to spend a year in dialogue and try to get the people out there to change their position and their direction. But I have a feeling that it's not going to succeed. I read where there was 80% of the conference behind the vote, what was done out there. 80%. So it's going to be an uphill battle. And I don't know. what's going to happen, but I think we're going to be in for some difficult times. It was a split vote, too. It was, at the final vote at the Autumn Council, this is all public information, so I'm not sharing anything private with you. It was 166 votes that said we need to start taking measures, and 122 that said that's too heavy-handed. We should not do that. And so all it would take by next year is 22 more people to change their vote, and it could fall all apart next council. So, and what they wanted to do at the next council was to put teeth in it, to have some disciplinary measures that would be taken if they didn't listen. So, the question really that's before us today is, are we going to obey? Because if we don't obey, then we have this promise that God says you're going to have all kinds of problems happen to you. Yes.
Disciplinary actions will be in trouble with the government because this is discrimination. If this woman is capable, and it's only because she's a woman that she should not be in that position. That's the only reason. This is no good.
Well, it's not quite as simple as that. The church, has had rules for many years in regard to ordination. And so they went against that and pressed on. It's not specifically because she's a woman that she can't hold the office. It's because she is not authorized to be ordained. See, she's not supposed to be ordained. Now, I don't know whether they ordained her or not, or whether they just put, what's the other, commissioning. A commissioned pastor is not eligible to be president. So I don't know whether they went ahead and ordained her against General Conference policy or not. I sort of think they did, but that's the real problem. If the church votes to ordain women, then a woman can be president, no problem. She can serve in whatever capacity. But that has not been voted, and so it is rebellion against the policy of the church, voted by the world, the whole world church. Yes.
It's my understanding that commissioning is like semantics. It means the same thing.
Yeah, but it doesn't have the same opportunities that the ordination has. So, anyway, I don't want to get too deep into that, but my main point is we need to watch ourselves as Seventh-day Adventists. We cannot expect the blessings of God if we don't obey. Now, sometimes I wonder if people are thinking that we as Seventh-day Adventists can do whatever we please and God will never do what he did to the children of Israel. I don't think that's true. Otherwise, he'd have to go back and apologize to the Israelites. So the focus today needs to be on bringing ourselves into harmony with the Word of God in every respect. This is a very significant date tomorrow. And one of the things that's supposed to go on during this time is that we're supposed to be asking God, is there any way that my life is out of harmony with your will? Help me to find it out and to ask forgiveness for breaking what you said to do, and to help me to get my life into harmony with your will. And right now, mercy still lingers, but But that's not going to linger forever. So now is the time. And it's been 172 years. I mean, it doesn't take God that long to look at everybody's life throughout the history. So he's extending the time to give us more time to come into harmony with what he said. And if we don't do that, we're going to suffer, I believe. But maybe if we suffer, some will wake up. I don't know. You know what's going to happen. Only God knows the exact future. Well,